Another thing they also knew after the American Revolution was that the bankers would take over if you did not keep them in check. That was so widely discussed. I won't even bother mentioning the books to read about it, but that was the cause of big debates at the very beginning, because they understood what had happened in Europe. They watched Europe. They knew the history. There's one thing about people back then, they had better educations, those at least who had the private educations, as all education was back then in the 1700s. They had better educations than the average person has today. They could read Latin and Greek. They knew the histories of ancient cultures. They knew the histories down through to the present time. And they knew that tyranny always existed. It's the nature within society of struggle for power between dominant people. And every generation more are born. They want dominance and power. Everybody else suffers because of it down through the ages, but nothing has changed up to the present time. And when you get leagues of them, combinations of the same characters who have money and power and seek more power, you're in big trouble. They talk about the ability to do it simply through money manipulation and the ownership of money and the distribution of money alone. Thomas Jefferson wrote to John Taylor in 1816, and it's in the letters of Jefferson. And it says, the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity, meaning future generations, under the name of funding, is but swindling futurity on a large scale. It's nothing but a swindle, all this borrowing money stuff. Always has been a swindle. Why should governments be borrowing anything from anywhere when they supposedly run the whole country within on everything which they collect on taxes? It used to be export and import taxes only. That was enough to run the countries, especially the U.S. But of course, once the good times roll and folk are getting happy, they stop watching what's going on. And the big boys know it, and away they go. And wars are fantastic for this. Under war, you give up all these rights thinking you'll get through it, and things will go back to normal. Well, Professor Carl Quigley said, again, the historian for the Council on Foreign Relations, he says wars have different purposes, but one of the main purposes is to change society. He says you can get more done in 5 years of war on a governmental and bureaucratic level of change than you can in 50 years of peace and propaganda. We give up our rights and we never go back to where we were. Never. And you're always left with a massive debt. It was only 2 or 3 years ago that Britain admitted it had just finished paying off the debt for World War I. They've still got World War II, Korea, and a whole bunch of other ones to go since then. Plus the so-called present war on terror is costing more than any of them. Back with more after this break. And I've used analogies so many times in the past where it's like being laboratory rats. And you're in big cages in the laboratory, and at night the lights go off and you have some peace and you can chat to each other, and then you fall asleep. And in the morning you wake up early and you sit and natter amongst yourselves about what they're going to do to you today. What do you think they're going to do? Will they stick the electrodes in their brain today, or is it going to be the injections, and so on and so on? That's all we do, is we repeat the news and repeat the news. We're repeating the effects of things, but never getting into the causes of things. Why? Why is that? Because we don't want to believe, in a sense, that it's really that bad. We don't want to believe that, yeah, this has actually been done on purpose. And until people can cross that barrier, yeah, they are doing this. They have got to a stage where they really want to depopulate. They have gotten to the stage, and if you read their global meetings, you'll find about sustainability. If you go into the archives from the Optimum Population Trust, and I have some of them on my own website, go into them, and these are big players in the world field talking about depopulation by every and all means possible, until you cross that barrier and say, my God, they're actually doing it, they're serious. Then you'll still be left in la-la land, in a no man's land of irritation, anger, and agitation because of, look what they're doing to us today. Well, guess what? I could pick up another 100 articles tomorrow and read them, and the next day, and the next day. And you know something? Yapping about it doesn't do a darn thing. It's a mental leap you've got to take and cross over and accept the fact that war has been declared upon you on every level a long time ago. And all these articles are just the effects of that war. Can you believe, for an instance, those at the top don't know these things? Look at who is behind Obama. Never mind Obama. I always say the presidents and prime ministers are nothing but frontmen. It's the ones behind them that's important. And here you have a lineup of ardent globalists. Some of them were communists not so long ago, openly. They all talked about the need to depopulate. I've gone over the articles written by them, and some of them wrote books about it back in the 60s and 70s and later even. We should be very, very afraid. Here they are in power, and we think, well, they're different once they're in power. It's like a religious conversion, I guess. They swear allegiance, they go through all that stuff, and they're converted into just normal Americans now. Do you really, really believe that? Do you really believe that? God help you if you do. They can bypass all the democratic principles, and they've been doing it for so long now, they can't even keep up with executive orders. Britain has the same thing, executive orders. When they want something on the global agenda to go through, rather than have it debated in public, and it's in Parliament, that's what they call in public, and argued upon, they want to rush something through, they put off a diplomatic expert to the Queen, and she signs it into law, and that's law. That's what they call democracy in Britain. The most important things that we should know of what's happening are kept secret from the public under Official Secrets Acts, not to be published. You know, the free trade negotiations for the amalgamations of the Americas that was really the precursor for NAFTA, it set up the foundation for NAFTA, is buried outside Ottawa, underground, in an archive, and hasn't to be opened for another, I think, 30 to 50 years. That's a great democracy. That's democracy in action. Why would they have to keep that secret from the public? Because we see in 30 to 50 years there will be no Canada. There will be no United States of America. Certainly not as anything that you could possibly recognize. That's what they do. And we think we're voting people in. We go through that farce. We think we're voting people in for us. People who are vetted through an institution way so high that you don't even know they exist. They vet every one of those guys long in advance. Here's a good example of what the public, it was kept from the public. You know, most of the stuff that happened during the Cold War, by the way, is still reclassified for 50 years. Pierre Trudeau, what a character this guy was. He was an ardent communist, not just a sympathizer or fellow traveler, ardent communist. He led the Comintern, Young Communist Party for Canada, over to the Comintern meeting in Moscow in 1952. During World War II, he went up and down the docks at Halifax on a motorcycle with a German helmet on, yelling at all the troops embarking to go off and fight the Germans, because at that time, you see, Moscow and Germany had an alliance to fight together. Of course, he threw away the helmet as soon as he was ordered to, and was against Germany once Germany and Stalin fell out. But he eventually became Prime Minister of Canada. And he altered totally the face of Canada for internationalism, just like Mr. Brown did the same thing and Mr. Blair did the same thing in Britain. And Pierre Trudeau reclassified a document that was written and put under Official Secrets Act in 1947, I think it was, for 30-odd years. On his last day of being in office, he reclassified it for another 30 to 50 years. What was that list? It was a list of all the communist members from the first defector from the Soviet Union, of all the guys who were working in the Canadian and American bureaucracies, hundreds of them. Reclassified that again from the public. We're not supposed to know. Why? Because, you see, they take care of their own. That's why. It was already communist back then. And their offspring are now working in the same jobs, and governments too. Here's what happened in Britain. Now, David Kelly was a top scientist who spoke out against Blair going into Iraq. He said it was all baloney. There was no weapons of mass destruction. David Kelly also was a scientist who worked with Israel on ethnic-specific diseases, viruses for warfare purposes. This is a very important guy. He worked for the British government in collusion with Israel for future wars. And here's an article here. He was murdered. Before he was going up to a high court and inquiry to expose this stuff, he was found dead. And everybody took the official version, oh, he committed suicide, even though his wife said it was baloney. Even though he said 2 days before, they'll find me in the forest with my arms slit. And the official version came out, and a bunch of doctors got together and demanded a second autopsy. And they got it, and said this guy was murdered. Well, guess what? This is from the Mail Online, and it's from January 2010, 23rd. David Kelly, post-mortem, that's autopsy, to be kept secret for 70 years. This is your freedom and democracy. It says, as doctors accuse Lord Hutton of concealing vital information. Vital evidence which could solve the mystery of the death of government weapons Inspector Dr. David Kelly will be kept under wraps for up to 70 years. Why would we possibly say we've got democracy? We've been dragged into wars, utterly contrived, completely lied to. Whole nations were lied to over and over and over and over again, ad nauseum, if we can all remember it, by our government leaders, for geopolitical purposes and big finance. And we were told nothing of the truth. And by using that technique, well, they might have weapons of mass destruction, or they have them, they can invade anybody they wish to. So what do they do when everybody comes up with vital evidence? They kill them. And then when the autopsy comes up, they put it under the Official Secrets Act. Nobody's to know the results for 70 years. Well, in 70 years, no one will care. And that is the world that you live in. And it happens in the U.S. just the same. With orders and council and executive orders, all the same thing. No public input, nothing. No explanations to the public either. Why bother? And you know something, it's quite true. 87% of the public don't care what's going on at any particular time. They really don't. They really, really don't. There was a survey done in World War I by the big marketing companies, and it's one of the first big polls they did. It was to find out how people really thought about the war and getting into the war and involvement in the war and all the rest of it. And they really found that 87% of the public didn't really care what was happening, really much about anything up there. It was Plato that said it thousands of years ago, that a public who doesn't watch government is under tyranny, or will be under tyranny. You're encouraged not to look into government. In fact, you're encouraged to feel that you're somehow alienated from it, and it's an autonomous thing that just runs above you. It's autonomous, it's like gravity, it just exists, you know. And you're trained now to believe that specialists somehow run the world to our advantage. You don't have to worry your little head. Go and play. Go and play and be happy. They've got all kinds of ways to make you happy. If you're not happy about things, go and get pills from a doctor and make you happy. As long as you're happy, that's all that matters. But whatever you do, don't get involved in what's going on. Whatever you do, don't do that. Apart from that, what can you do about it? Who are you? You're told this, you're felt to feel small and useless. But then again, think of the incredible show that's put on for you. This show of politics, this show of elections, this constant show of speaking to the people. It's a big show. They need you to believe in this. They need you because they need you to cooperate, don't they? How do you cooperate? By your compliance to everything that's done to you. That's how you cooperate. And we're cooperating into the grave.